Breaking news, you're looking at video of one of the last times Oscar winner Gene Hackman, a known recluse in recent years.
Now with new details on the investigation into the death of actor Gene Hackman, including newly released video.
As for the inside footage, Hackman's estate wants to block that release, citing privacy.
Inside the tunnel beneath Cedar Hollow Manor, the air is cold enough to fog a flashlight beam. The stone walls sweat with moisture that has no source. The silence down there isn't peaceful. It's total. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. No wind reaches this deep. No sound from the world above survives the descent. Just the slow, patient drip of water somewhere in the dark, falling onto stone that hasn't seen daylight in nearly a century. When state investigators first entered the property, they had already found 2 bodies in the mansion above. They had documented a library torn apart, an open safe, furniture dragged across hardwood floors as if someone or something had been searching for hours. They believed they understood what they were looking at. A tragedy, yes, but a contained one. They thought the worst was behind them. Then someone noticed the bookshelf that didn't sit quite right against the wall. And everything changed. Nobody on that estate, not the groundskeepers, not the housekeeping staff, not the private security contractors who had patrolled those grounds for over a decade, had any idea that a passage existed behind that wall. That single fact reframes everything that came after it. Walter Pimton, one of the most celebrated character actors of his generation, a man who had spent 60 years in front of cameras, had spent decades quietly building a life around a secret buried directly beneath his own home. And he very nearly took that secret with him. What investigators found at the bottom of those stone steps was never meant to see daylight again. And what it reveals about the man who lived above it, that part of the story is only just beginning. It was a great Tuesday morning when a convoy of unmarked vehicles arrived at the reinforced iron gates hidden deep in the pine forest outside the small town of Aldermere. Behind those gates sat a sprawling stone compound, 11,000 square feet of restored colonial architecture sitting on nearly 200 acres of private timberland. This was the estate of Walter Pimton, 88 years old, retired from acting for over a decade, and his wife of 40 years, Eleanor Voss, 71, a former concert violinist who had quietly become one of the region's most respected art conservators. Nobody had heard from either of them in 9 days. No deliveries accepted. No calls returned. The household staff, normally a tight, almost invisible operation, simply hadn't shown up for work. And when a property manager tried to investigate, he found his access codes had been deactivated. It was a part-time caretaker, a man who tended the orchard on the estate's eastern edge, who finally called the county sheriff. He told the dispatcher, in a voice that the dispatcher later described as eerily calm, that he believed something had happened to the Pimtons and that nobody should go in there alone. The gates had to be cut open. The locks, heavy, custom-forged steel, showed no signs of tampering from outside. Whatever had happened on that property, it hadn't come from beyond the walls. When the first deputies stepped onto the grounds, they expected to find an elderly couple who had simply passed away together, quietly, the way long-married people sometimes do. What they found instead didn't match that story at all. Walter Pimton and Eleanor Voss were discovered inside the manor, in separate rooms, along with their elderly retriever. The medical examiner later determined that Eleanor had died nearly a week before Walter, her cause of death attributed to complications from a respiratory infection she had apparently chosen not to treat. Walter's cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, with age and underlying conditions as contributing factors. On paper, it was a sad but unremarkable story. 2 elderly people, isolated by choice, passing within days of each other. But the scene itself told a different story. The sheriff's department released a brief statement saying there was no indication of foul play, language designed to close the book quickly and quietly. But in that same statement, almost as an afterthought, they noted that the property would remain under extended forensic review, language that, in 20 years of similar cases, almost never accompanies a finding of natural causes. No foul play, but an extended forensic review involving specialists from outside the county, brought in within 48 hours. Those 2 facts do not belong in the same sentence. And then there's the timeline. Eleanor died nearly a week before Walter did. That means an 88-year-old man spent up to 7 days alone in that house, with his wife's body, making no call for help. No ambulance. No neighbor contacted. No staff summoned. What keeps a man silent for 7 days? Grief, certainly. Confusion, maybe in a man that age. But there's a third possibility that investigators couldn't ignore. That calling for help would have meant letting strangers into a house that was never supposed to be searched. And that whatever was hidden beneath that house would have been found far sooner than it eventually was. To understand what investigators eventually found underground, you first have to understand what sat above it. Cedar Hollow Manor wasn't simply a large house. It was, by any reasonable definition, a private fortress. The original structure dated back to the 1880s, built by a timber baron whose fortune had mysteriously evaporated within a generation. Walter Pimton had purchased the property in the early 1980s, at the height of his career, and had spent the following 4 decades quietly renovating it, not into something flashier, but into something far more secure. 12-foot stone walls ran the perimeter of the inner compound, nearly invisible from the access road thanks to deliberate landscaping. Motion-activated lighting and camera systems covered every approach. The household staff, never more than 6 people at any given time, were bound by non-disclosure agreements, so restrictive that one former groundskeeper later told a local reporter he'd been advised not to discuss the layout of the property, even with his own family. And it worked. In 40 years, across dozens of employees, there was never a single leak about what life inside Cedar Hollow Manor was actually like. In an era when nothing stays private, that kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. Someone built it that way, on purpose, and maintained it for decades. When investigators finally walked through the manor's interior, what struck them first wasn't suspicious, it was simply staggering. The walls were lined with original paintings, some attributed to minor European masters that our historians hadn't realized were in private hands. The library held first editions stacked floor to ceiling. The conservatory, which Eleanor had maintained personally, contained botanical specimens that a visiting horticulturist later described as museum grade, the kind of thing you'd expect at a research institution, not a private home. Dr. Adriana Cole, an architectural historian who consulted on the property's eventual assessment, described the layout in stark terms. She said that in 20 years of documenting historic estates across the region, she had never seen anything quite like it, a house designed simultaneously as a showcase and as a stronghold. The beauty, she said, was completely real. So were the countermeasures. And in her experience, that combination only exists when someone is protecting something specific, something they consider more valuable than the art on the walls. She turned out to be right. Investigators reviewing the scene found signs that someone had moved through the house before they arrived, and not gently. Furniture had been shifted away from walls. Books had been pulled from shelves and replaced haphazardly, spines facing the wrong direction. A safe in the upstairs study had been opened and emptied, its contents unknown. Drawers throughout the house sat half open, as though someone had been searching, methodically, but in a hurry. And then in the library on the ground floor, behind a section of paneling that didn't quite line up with the rest of the wall, they found it. The mechanism wasn't a secret lever behind a painting, or a bookcase on a hinge, the kind of thing you'd expect from an old movie. It was something far more deliberate. A section of the library's eastern wall, indistinguishable from the rest, concealed a recessed panel that required a specific sequence of pressure points to release. Whoever built it hadn't wanted it to be discoverable by accident. They had wanted it to be invisible to anyone who didn't already know exactly where to look, and exactly how. Behind the panel, a narrow stone stairway, descending into total darkness. No electrical wiring. No ventilation shafts. Just hand-cut stone steps disappearing downward into the earth. The temperature dropped almost immediately. By the time investigators were 10 steps down, their breath was visible in the beam of their flashlights. The air thickened, heavier damp, carrying a faint mineral smell, like wet iron. Moisture clung to every surface. And as the flashlight beams swept across the walls, the lead investigator stopped walking entirely. The walls were covered in markings. Not graffiti. Not decoration left behind by bored teenagers who'd once found their way down here. These were deliberate, precise inscriptions, carved by hand, with real tools, by someone who clearly knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what they wanted to record. Some of the markings resembled old surveying notation, measurements, angles, reference points. Others looked almost like diagrams, gears, levers, interlocking shapes that, on closer inspection, resembled blueprints for some kind of mechanical apparatus. Nobody on the initial team could identify what the apparatus was supposed to do. The construction itself told its own story. Near the top of the staircase, close to the library, the stonework was clearly more recent, mid-20th century at the earliest, with cleaner cuts and some concrete reinforcement. But the deeper the investigators went, the rougher and older the construction became. Hand-chiseled joints, primitive mortar, tool marks that, according to the structural engineer later brought in to assess the space, were consistent with hand tools from well over a century ago, long before Pimton ever purchased the property. That engineer, a man named Frank Marsh who had spent 30 years assessing historic foundations and mine shafts across the region, put it simply, the upper section had clearly been renovated and reinforced by someone living in the house. But the core of the tunnel, the deep stonework, the oldest sections, predated the house's current owners by generations. Pimton hadn't built this place. He'd found it, and he'd kept it. At the bottom of the staircase, the passage opened into a chamber roughly the size of a small barn, a space that felt frozen in time the moment investigators' flashlights swept across it. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked 3 and 4 high. Many of them collapsed from decades of moisture and age, their contents spilled across the stone floor. Yellowed paper, rusted tools, objects that, at first glance, didn't seem to belong to any single identifiable era. One investigator carefully lifted the lid of a crate near the entrance and found a stack of photographs, brittle and curling at the edges. The people in them wore clothing from roughly the early 20th century. Several images showed small groups of men gathered around tables covered in maps and documents, lit by a single overhead bulb, their faces caught mid-conversation. On the back of one photograph, in faded ink, someone had written a date, 1931, and a short phrase in a regional dialect that the investigating team initially struggled to translate. Beside the photograph sat leather-bound ledgers, filled with handwritten entries, dates, initials, references to transactions and meetings that corresponded to no records the team could locate. Several pages had been deliberately torn out. Others showed scorch marks along the edges, as though someone had started to burn them and then stopped, for reasons that were impossible to know. The volume of material was enormous. Investigators estimated that a full inventory of the chamber's contents could take well over a year. But it was the floor that drew the most attention. Carved directly into the stone were a series of overlapping circular patterns, intricate, clearly deliberate, the kind of design that would have taken enormous time and care to produce. From above, the patterns resembled star charts, clusters of points connected by fine lines, arranged in configurations that an astronomer later consulted on the case described as corresponding to specific celestial alignments, not random patterns, but a kind of map recorded at a particular moment in time for reasons nobody could yet explain. Whoever carved those patterns wasn't decorating a basement. They were recording something, or marking it for someone who would come later and know how to read it. The tools recovered from the crates added another layer to the mystery. Several pieces of equipment, small mechanical devices, gears, a palm-sized cylinder with internal rotating rings, showed a level of craftsmanship that puzzled the engineers who examined them. The cylinder, in particular, appeared to have been cast as a single piece with no visible seams or joints, a manufacturing feat that, according to one materials specialist, will be genuinely difficult to replicate even with modern techniques, let alone whatever tools would have been available when the rest of the chamber was carved. A retired forensic analyst, Dr. Howard Lynn, who had spent nearly 2 decades processing evidence for federal investigations before retiring, was asked to review the publicly available case summary. He noted that when an investigation goes quiet this quickly, it usually means one of 2 things. Either there's genuinely nothing more to say, or the findings have moved beyond the scope of the original investigators entirely into territory that requires a very different kind of decision-making. He didn't say which one he thought this was, but he didn't need to. The town of Aldermere had always had its theories about Cedar Hollow Manor, most of them dismissed, for decades, as the kind of stories small towns tell about the big house on the hill. Margaret Innes had owned a neighboring property for over 20 years. She remembered the sound's low, rhythmic vibrations that would start in the early hours of the morning, 2 or 3 times a month, never on any predictable schedule. Not plumbing, not heating systems. Something deeper, something industrial, something she said she could feel in her chest more than hear with her ears. She mentioned it to Walter Pimton once, the property line, half joking. He didn't laugh. He told her quietly that some things were better left where they were. She remembered the look on his face for years afterward. A retired geologist who lived a few miles down the road had, years earlier, set up a basic seismograph out of personal curiosity after noticing similar vibrations on his own property. The readings he recorded didn't match any natural geological activity in the area. They were too regular, too mechanical, occurring on what looked almost like a schedule. He filed a report with the county. Nothing ever came of it. Former staff members, when they eventually left Cedar Hollow Manor, tended to simply disappear from the area entirely. New jobs, new towns, no contact with old coworkers. One housekeeper, who had worked at the estate for several years in the early 2000s, told a friend shortly before she moved away that she'd seen things on the property she wasn't supposed to see. She never elaborated. Within a month, she was gone. And during one of the renovations that first exposed sections of the tunnel's upper stonework, workers discovered an old wiring system running through the manor's walls. Not telephone lines, not anything connected to the property's modern systems. A separate, self-contained circuit, connecting the library directly to somewhere below. The wiring predated modern telecommunications by decades, but it had clearly been maintained, kept functional quietly for generations. Private line, off any grid, connecting the house above to whatever was kept below. Nobody the investigators spoke to could say who or what had ever been on the other end of that line. Here's what people tend to forget about Walter Pimton. Before the walls, before the silence, before he stepped away from public life entirely in his 70s, he was known, genuinely known, as one of the warmest people in the industry. Not in a performative, red carpet way. In a way that made people who met him once feel like they'd known him for years. The owner of a small diner near Aldermere remembered him stopping in every week or two for over a decade, always sitting at the same corner table, always asking about the owner's kids by name, their ages, their schools, how they were doing. He tipped generously every time without making a show of it. At the farmer's market, vendors knew him on sight. He'd buy more vegetables than two people could possibly eat and joke about it on his way out. A local librarian remembered him lingering after community events, genuinely curious about whatever conversation he found himself in, present in a way that people with his level of fame rarely are. This was not, by any account, a man built for isolation. And that's the detail that matters most. People don't wall themselves off from a life they clearly loved unless something forces them to. The cameras, the legal agreements, the silence of everyone who ever worked on that property. The walls weren't built by an eccentric old man who'd simply grown tired of people. They were built around something, maintained around something. For decades. Across his career, Pemberton had played more than his share of men caught inside secrets too large for them. Characters who built walls because the alternative was worse. It's tempting to wonder, now, whether some of that resonance came from somewhere real. Whether a man who spent his life pretending to guard impossible secrets on screen had, off-screen, been quietly doing exactly that. The official cause of death, cardiac arrest, age-related, is entirely plausible on its own. But it doesn't explain why a man with access to the best medical care in the country chose to spend his final days completely isolated, with no calls made, no staff present, the household's interior cameras manually switched off. And it doesn't explain the detail that troubled investigators most. When they found the tunnel entrance, the mechanism wasn't sealed. It had been used recently, within days, according to the dust patterns on the steps. An 88-year-old man had gone down into that cold passage, alone, not long before he died. What was he checking? What was he looking for? Or, and this is the question nobody wants to ask directly, was he making sure something was still where it was supposed to be? At the far end of the underground chamber, past the crates, past the scattered ledgers, past the star charts carved into the stone floor, investigators found one more thing. A door. Set directly into the rock. Iron, heavily corroded, with weld marks running along every visible seam. No handle on the outside. No hinges visible from where they stood. It had been sealed shut, and sealed as far as anyone could tell from the inside. To date, no official statement has addressed what, if anything, lies beyond that door. The case has effectively gone quiet. No follow-up briefings. No leaked details. In an environment where information usually finds its way out eventually, that level of silence is, in itself, unusual. What we do know is that a team of specialists, historians, materials experts, an astronomer brought in to interpret the floor carvings, spent months working through the chamber's contents. And then gradually the updates stopped altogether. Whatever was found down there, someone decided it didn't need to be explained to anyone. Walter Pemberton spent the better part of his life building a silence so complete that not even the people closest to him ever fully understood it. He carried whatever was beneath that house from the height of his career to the final days of his life. And when he died, he was the last person who fully understood what was down there and why it mattered. Now it's just a locked door in a cold room under a house that no one lives in anymore. So, was Walter Pemberton protecting something that had been left behind long before he ever arrived? Or was he protecting the world from something that was never meant to be found at all?